Welcome to episode 2 of I Told You So, a podcast, a video series, whatever you'd like to call it. What we're doing is saying I told you so as we break down all of the terrible things that will come, that are inevitable, that have happened throughout Donald Trump's presidency, and as you can see here, leading up to such. Last week, I discussed and pondered upon why exactly Kamala Harris had lost the 2024 election. That's in the past. We're done with the cope. Now we move forward to holding these people accountable. And given that we know who Donald Trump is already, and given that he is not actually president yet, I figured that this is a great time to kind of continuously release videos, not necessarily focusing solely on Donald Trump, but the people that he's surrounding himself with, whether it's in his cabinet, whether it's in Republican leadership, or just people like Elon Musk who seem to be clinging to his left, not the entire time that he is doing any kind of public engagement anymore, or speaking to world leaders on the phone. There are plenty of people that I could have done an introductory episode of Nightmare Blunt Rotation, which is exactly what this whole administration seems to be. I could have talked about anti-vaxxer Robert Kennedy Jr. I could have talked about Fox News host Pete Hegseth, and we most certainly will. But I thought it was a useful exercise in going over someone who I think is going to have not only a large amount of sway in the overall Trump administration, who has been kind of swept under the rug amid all of these other nonsensical appointments like Congressman or former Congressman, as of now, Matt Gaetz. Someone who I think I see rising up as a leader in the Republican Party leading into the 2028 presidential election, and that is Congresswoman Elise Stefanik and eventual future U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Before I delve a little bit more into who she is, what her credentials are, the things that she's said and done that might give you some insight into how she will perform the functions of the job, I just want to make clear that we can trash these people all we'd like. We can hate them. We can give them a giant fuck you on Twitter. But at the end of the day, it is in everyone's best interest that these people perform their jobs well. And we need to hold each and every one of these people that I'll be talking about in Nightmare Blunt Rotation to account. And again, fuck them for siding with a man who has literally tried to overturn the results of the election that didn't go in his favor. There does need to be some hope that the common good will reign supreme and that these people will govern with that in mind. And I think it's important to think about also, given the nature of a lot of these appointments, that obviously a lot of these people are individuals that Trump has appointed to carry out his policy goals, whether you agree with them or not. But I also think there is a certain classification of people who have been appointed to not perform their job or perform their jobs well. And I can look at nominee to be administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, former Congressman Liz Zeldin. And trust me, we will most certainly get deep into Mr. Zeldin. But this episode is going to be about Ms. Stefanik and what she may do or what we can expect of her as the ambassador to the United Nations. Now, first and foremost, what exactly is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. They represent the United States at the United Nations, and they serve as the primary voice and advocate for U.S. interests and policies within that international body. They typically will participate in meetings. They will join sessions of the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. And to not get too much into the weeds there, they will negotiate, advocate, and look to build coalitions to address global issues such as security, human rights, climate change, and international development. The UN ambassador also communicates and collaborates with representatives of other countries and works closely with the U.S. government to ensure that American policies and priorities are effectively promoted and protected on the international stage. The United States' involvement in the United Nations is not only essential in securing American policy goals abroad or domestically, depending on what the particular issue might be, but U.S. influence in the United Nations also serves to dampen the sway of other international actors that may not necessarily be attuned to the goals of the United States. And when I say that, I mostly say China. Now, who is Elise Stefanik? Where does she come from? Well, she is the number 4 House Republican at this point. She is a congresswoman from New York. And just to put it broadly, she has been a staunch supporter of Donald Trump and currently serves as the House Republican Conference Chair. However, she does have limited foreign policy experience, and that has raised concerns about her preparedness for the role. Now, I do say proposed UN ambassador for a reason, because she would need to be confirmed by the Senate, and this is likely to happen. Again, amid all of the crazy picks that Donald Trump has nominated for his cabinet, she is most certainly not among the craziest. She started her career as a moderate and eventually shifted into becoming more of the type of MAGA Republican that we see her as today. She will succeed Linda Thomas Greenfield from the Biden administration, who was a career diplomat and former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. Ms. Stefanik won her latest election in November with 62% of the vote. She went from, again, being the 19th most bipartisan member of Congress when she was first elected, and once she was infected with the Trump worm, she dropped way down. In Congress, she supported Trump's position approximately 80% of the time. And she is naturally ecstatic about this nomination. She says, "I'm truly honored to earn President Trump's nomination and serve in his cabinet as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. During my conversation with President Trump, I shared how deeply humbled I am to accept his nomination and that I look forward to earning the support of my colleagues in the United States Senate. President Trump's historic landslide election has given hope to the American people and is a reminder of the brighter days ahead, both at home and abroad. America continues to be the beacon of the world, but we expect and must demand that our friends and allies be strong partners in the peace we seek. The work ahead is immense as we see anti-Semitism skyrocketing, coupled with 4 years of a catastrophically weak U.S. leadership that significantly weakened our national security and diminished our standing in the eyes of both allies and adversaries. I stand ready to advance President Donald J. Trump's restoration of America First peace through strength leadership on the world stage on day one at the United Nations." And she goes on to glaze everyone who has kind of put her in this position, her family, friends, colleagues, etc., etc. Now, she is the current House Conference Chair, making her, again, the number 4 leading Republican in the United States House of Representatives. Her district covers most of the North Country in the Adirondack Mountains, some of the outer suburbs of Utica, and the Capital District in New York. The Republicans, who right now hold a slim majority in the House of Representatives, will ultimately have to compete in another election to replace her. But it's likely that a Republican will take her place, given how she handily won just a few weeks ago, again with 62% of the vote. She is a Harvard graduate, a former aide to George W. Bush, She served on his domestic policy council and worked in his chief of staff's office when George Bush was president. Notably, she refused to certify the 2020 election results after the January 6th insurrection. She wholeheartedly backed Trump's claims that, mind you, were unfounded, untrue, a flat-out lie, that the election was stolen from him. And she had even objected to the certification of Pennsylvania's election results. She included herself among a group of more than 100 House Republicans who signed on to a court brief filed in a Supreme Court case after the 2020 election that was essentially a long-shot bid to overturn the election results in 4 battleground states. She has made false claims of fraud, saying, among other things, that more than 140,000 votes came from underage, deceased, and otherwise unauthorized voters in Fulton County, Georgia. Interesting she could make that claim, being all the way from New York, and again, not having any evidence of such. And she, like Donald Trump, has alleged that Nancy Pelosi was responsible for the attacks on January 6th. Now, that's pretty fucking batshit insane already, but I figured let's start with some of the worst things, and maybe we can find some reasons to think that she may be a positive representative abroad. I'll let you make the determination on that. But she currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, and she's chaired the panel subcommittees on intelligence and special operations, emerging threats, cyber information technologies, and innovation. She sits on the House Intelligence Committee and Education and Workforce Committee, and she is a member of the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of Federal Government, which was created in 2023 when Republicans took the House after alleging mistreatment of Trump by federal investigators. So essentially, she was a member of a fake, or I guess depends how you define fake, but a member of a committee that was designed to investigate the Biden administration for their supposed injustice against Donald Trump. Now, she currently serves as conference chair, which, as I've said a few times now, is a very high up position in Republican House leadership. She, ironically enough, ended up replacing Liz Cheney in this position, which I think is a living metaphor for how this administration is being pumped full of people who have expressed their unwavering loyalty to Trump, and not necessarily a coherent level of experience being the primary factor in the appointments that he's making. She challenged Liz Cheney for her position soon after the January 6th attacks, which seemed to be Liz Cheney's line in the sand that Donald Trump can no longer stand to not only serve as the leader of the Republican Party, to be the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. Now, she challenged Cheney for her position under the guise that Donald Trump was wholeheartedly innocent in his actions leading up to and on January 6th. And she, as you can imagine, had no problem defeating her opposition, Chip Roy, at the time, once Trump threw his public support behind Stefanik for the position. And this also goes to show the sway that Donald Trump has over at least the House of Representatives in putting the people that he wants in power in these positions. And it'll be interesting to see when Stefanik is confirmed as UN ambassador, who will end up taking her place as the number 4 Republican in Congress, or in the House of Representatives, rather. Going through all of the things that she has defended Donald Trump over, we can talk about Donald Trump's criminal fraud case in New York. She had filed an ethics complaint against the judge in New York who was hearing the case at the time, saying that he was not fit to preside over this matter and eventually should disqualify himself. During Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, she was a vehement defender of Trump. And I think it's very critical to look at what that first impeachment trial was even about, which was centered on Trump blackmailing Vladimir Zelensky with missiles in order to obtain dirt on Joe Biden, his political rival at the time. And in the midst of this, she confronted Adam Schiff, who was running the impeachment hearing. And as we know, the Senate did not vote to remove Donald Trump from office, but the impeachments do still stand. And she has introduced a non-binding resolution that seeks to expunge both of Trump's impeachments by the House. So essentially, she wants to remove these blemishes, so to speak, from Donald Trump's record. Though I don't think 2 impeachments is really something that the American people or history will ever be able to forget. A positive, she is the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She was elected at the age of 30. And it's important to note that she did end up swinging this district to her side. Her district previously voted for Barack Obama twice, and it was represented by Democrats for 100 years before her election. Concerning her positions on foreign policy, she has very much so made clear that Israel is her number one priority. Throughout her tenure in Congress, and even in her statement that I didn't read the entirety of, she has been very, very vocally pro-Israel. And she has publicly berated the UN for what she perceives is anti-Israel bias, such as the resolutions from the United Nations that have condemned Israel for its actions in Gaza. She had said in retaliation to these resolutions by the United Nations, the United States should just consider cutting funding to the United Nations as retaliation. She has come against the UN's criticism of how Israel has been prosecuting its war in Gaza and its continued opposition of settlements and the treatments of Palestinians in the West Bank. Just in October, she called for a complete reassessment of U.S. funding of the United Nations. And not only that, she has backed the blocking of U.S. support for the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And that's critical to note because right now that is the main provider of humanitarian aid in occupied territories and the surrounding areas in Gaza and the Middle East. And her reasoning for this is that she claims the group has failed to vet staff for members' ties to Hamas, which may be a valid concern hidden under the guise of an evil predilection. And like a lot of the Republican solutions to these problems nowadays, it just seems that let's say what she's saying is true. The remedy would be to maybe increase the United States' influence in vetting people who are working for these organizations, not to just completely tear it down, because if you tear something down, there's going to be a major vacuum, and a major vacuum when it comes to providing humanitarian relief in a time where tens of thousands of people have died and hundreds of thousands of more are starving and lack the basic necessities of life. It will only cause undue suffering for a certain community. And then broadly switching over to another huge foreign policy issue that is plaguing the world right now that Ms. Stefanik will no doubt be heavily integrated in is the Ukraine-Russia situation. And while she did, like many other Republicans, support early aid packages to the Ukraine, and has also co-sponsored Republican legislation to sanction Russia, she was one of 112 GOP lawmakers to oppose the latest $61 billion aid package for the Ukraine. And given her high-up tenure in the Republican Party, she was the most senior member of Republican leadership to vote against it. And she excused this decision by saying that she couldn't support allocating more money for non-lethal aid amid what she calls a crisis at the United States-Mexico border. So if we're looking at priorities here, she has made it clear that the situation at the border is a higher priority than that of ensuring that Ukraine is protected. And I do think that this is problematic for a few reasons, simply because, again, the Republican solution to the problem at the border is mass deportation, the dehumanizing rhetoric, the denaturalization process, the removal of birthright citizenship, the border wall, which will effectively waste billions of dollars and likely be rendered ineffective. And I think this is a problem because if you compare this to the situation with Russia and Ukraine, it has now become an investment that the United States has poured tens of billions of its own dollars in. And if we back out now, if we show a lack of support now for the Ukrainian people, it really just not only would serve to be a massive waste of money, but it will directly involve suffering of more Ukrainian people, a even larger amount of displacement of the Ukrainian people, and eventually a green light for actors like Russia and China to be able to take over whatever kind of territory they'd like, so long as they just throw their own citizens' bodies at it for X amount of time before the United States gets kind of tired about supporting these kinds of things. So that's not a very good outlook for the Ukrainian people. However, as we'll discuss, there are more pro-Ukraine members of Trump's cabinet, or what will be his cabinet, that may be able to provide a more solid foundation for convincing Trump that our goals in Ukraine are true, that our goals in Ukraine are valid, that they should be continued, and that Vladimir Putin should not just have a blank authority to do whatever he wants when it comes to land grabs. And ultimately, China as well, who has been wringing their hands over potentially invading and taking Taiwan back in what they believe is one China. Now, you may be familiar with Stefanik for her time when she had been sitting on the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And in December of 2023, she questioned the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and UPenn about the rise of anti-Semitism on their campus and their institutions' responses to calls for the genocide of Jews. Her line of questioning ended up leading to the resignation of the Harvard president, Claudine Gay, and the UPenn president, Elizabeth McGill, because of the kinds of wishy-washy answers that they gave did not necessarily satisfy, presumably, the boards that govern these institutions. And I'll literally read you the exact line of questioning right now. Stefanik, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules on bullying and harassment? Gay, the rules around bullying and harassment are quite specific. If the context in which that language is used amounts to bullying and harassment, then we take action. Stefanik, can you say yes to that question? Gay, calling for the genocide of Jews is anti-Semitic. Stefanik, so yes? Gay, when speech crosses into conduct, we take action. Stefanik, so is that a yes? The witness hasn't answered. Is that a yes? Gay, when speech crosses into conduct, we take action. Next, MIT President Sally Kornbluth, who did not resign, to my knowledge. Stefanik, at MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no? Kornbluth, if targeted in individuals, not making public statements. Stefanik, yes or no, calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment. Kornbluth, I have not heard calling for the genocide of Jews on our campus. Stefanik, but you've heard chants for intifada. Kornbluth, I've heard chants which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people. And UPenn President Elizabeth McGill, who did end up resigning. Stefanik, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct for when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no? McGill, it can be harassment. Stefanik, conduct meaning committing the act of genocide. The speech is not harassment. This is unacceptable. I will give you one more opportunity. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct? Yes or no? McGill, it can be harassment. So, not saying yes or no here, most certainly dissuade these institutions from, or at least Harvard and Penn, from keeping these presidents around. Whether or not you disagree or agree with the line of questioning or the responses by any of these presidents, it is absolutely certain that Stefanik, through these questions, have portrayed her as a staunch ally to the Israeli government. And even as these people were, I believe as Claudine Gay had tendered her resignation, Stefanik tweeted 1 down, 2 to go. So it was clear that her goal worked, in that this line of questioning ended up taking down established women who were leading reputable worldwide universities, but also garnered her national attention for an extended period of time. And because of the engagements that she had during this congressional hearing, she was awarded the Dr. Miriam and Sheldon Adelson Defender of Israel Award. And we can most certainly talk about how Elise Stefanik is a very pro-Israel politician, and that her actions and words after January 6th have alluded to the fact that she doesn't necessarily have any concern for the people living in Gaza or the Palestinian community at large, and that her focus is entirely on that of Israel and how they have been impacted by terrorist attacks. It is important to note that no matter how much of an ally she portrays herself, she did previously endorse Carl Palladino for Congress in New York's 23rd Congressional District, despite him praising Adolf Hitler on a radio show. He literally said that Hitler is the kind of leader that we need today. An interesting thing for someone who is pro-Israel, anti-Semitism, to support a guy who is out here praising Hitler. I think personally that would, for me, be a non-starter, but not for Congresswoman Stefanik. Might I add, Carl Palladino also called for the execution of Attorney General Merrick Garland. And soon after, she still decided to host a rally online for him anyway. Paired with her support of Donald Trump, it does seem that she is not quite the best judge of character, so to speak. But there is a lot of talk about this America First policy, this peace by strength, this threat, the constant threats from Trump and his cohorts about taking away aid to the United Nations, taking away aid to NATO and the international community at large, citing that they're not paying their fair share, that the United States contributes an outsized amount compared to what it receives. And I'm not going to say that those arguments are completely devoid of merit. I think that there's a conversation to be had. But I also do think it's important to note that for every little bit that the United States removes its influence from the United Nations, China will most absolutely be there to take its place. So whether intentional or not, creating a power vacuum in the United Nations will only serve to embolden China, who will look to use the United Nations as a tool to build its domestic and international policy objectives at home and abroad. Despite her rhetoric and any removal of the United States from the United Nations as a whole, she has been a very hardline anti-China advocate, I would say. She served on a House Republican China task force to survey the threats posed by Beijing. She has openly criticized China's trade practices and has even pushed to remove it from U.S. supply chains and critical U.S. infrastructure. She sponsored a variety of tough on China bills, including legislation that targets Chinese drone maker DJI. What this legislation would do is it would place DJI on the FCC's cover list, which would prohibit their products from being used in the United States communications infrastructure. And this bill was actually passed in the House in September. And look, I don't think having a hard line against China is a bad idea. So I do think that a lot of the bills that she's supported or proposed and the rhetoric that she has espoused concerning China isn't 100% bad. But again, it's what significance do these moves have if we will in turn, in lockstep, allow for China to trample over us on an international stage? It's like one step forward, two steps back, and that should not be the United States policy on China. One of the primary reasons why I'm talking about Elise Stefanik first is because the UN ambassador position is a coveted position that puts you in direct line with diplomats and dignitaries and world leaders that other cabinet positions really do not have. And you are put on the world stage as a representative of the United States in a way that not a lot of others are, beyond the Secretary of State and the President of the United States themselves. I want to draw a contrast between Stefanik to Nikki Haley, who was Ms. Stefanik's predecessor in the initial Trump administration. And many would argue that Haley did a great job as United Nations ambassador, but after 2 years, Haley resigned. And she was eventually, again, succeeded by a Trump loyalist, eventual U.S. Ambassador Kelly Craft. And she was the wife of a Kentucky coal magnate. And she previously, before succeeding Nikki Haley, was U.S. Ambassador to China. Trump is looking to not repeat the same mistakes that he did potentially with Haley in having someone who is not 100% on board with all of his plans and someone who will likely speak out about him once they're not in their position anymore. The UN ambassador is a very important position. There have been very notable people who have served in this position. Madeleine Albright, who went on to serve as Secretary of State, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, and George H.W. Bush all served as ambassadors to the United Nations. So it can serve as a trampoline, if you will, to higher office and to establishing those foreign policy credentials that people like Stefanik, who have only served in the House of Representatives, don't have. And former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, and also another former ambassador to the United Nations under George Bush, he acknowledges that Stefanik probably does want to run for president in 2028, and that this is a great way to get foreign policy experience and boost her credentials when she currently has absolutely fucking none. Is this the most necessary position to have a wide breadth of diplomatic experience? Maybe not. I wouldn't call, unlike a lot of Trump's other appointees, unqualified. But I do think it levies the question as to what her priorities are And through her work in these House committees, has she bolstered enough of an international repertoire to adequately convey the interests of the American people? And Nikki Haley, who only had domestic policy experience as former governor of South Carolina, seemed to step into the role relatively well. Whether or not we agreed with all of the statements she made is another question, but as UN ambassador, there is a component to it that is just how you carry yourself that is a very important part of the job. Some other things as to give you a little bit of perspective as to the kind of individual that Elise Stefanik is. I mean, she is a representative from New York, and you would expect her to have some moderate to left-leaning views on certain things, and she did criticize Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. She said it was a misguided decision that harms the ongoing effort to fight climate change while also isolating us from our allies. She publicly condemned Trump's Muslim ban, but she failed to condemn his family separation policy. When Trump was first elected, she did express skepticism as to Trump's ability to counter the Russian government and their meddling in our elections. She has openly admitted that Russia did meddle in the 2016 election in an attempt to aid Donald Trump, but she didn't criticize Trump directly for his handling of the crisis. So it's one of those things that, like many what seem to be reasonable people who have caught the MAGA bug, is she a completely different person than she was when she was first elected to Congress? And is she now wholeheartedly and wholefastly behind Donald Trump in whatever he says? And I think that that's going to be an important question to ask and something to observe going forward. Because I think that even if the first is true, like Nikki Haley, it doesn't seem that Trump wants a lot of pushback on his agenda. It may just mean that she has a very short tenure, as we've seen from a lot of people in the prior Trump administration, that if she does kind of vocalize her antagonism towards certain ideas that might benefit Russia or benefit China, but Trump still wants them done, he might not really give a fuck and just kind of give her the can anyway. And that's pretty much what I have on Congresswoman Stefanik. If there's anything I missed, feel free to leave a comment and let me know your thoughts on her appointment to this position and any concerns you have. If you're just fucking hype for this, then let me know as well. But before I go, there are a few things that I do want to discuss just briefly as to not take all of the energy and focus away from Donald Trump, because while he says a bunch of bullshit that doesn't necessarily matter, and we don't know if what he's saying is meant to kind of drive the news away from his fucking bonkers picks, or if he's actually being serious in the things that he's saying and doing, it might be worth it to just kind of look at these things just very briefly. So, some other things that have been happening. Elon Musk has been, like I said, hanging off of Donald Trump's right nut. In the lead up to the election, there was no doubt that Musk was a vocal supporter of Donald Trump, not only tweeting salacious things every few fucking minutes that may or may not be actually true concerning the 2024 election, he was throwing a fuck ton of money at this guy as well. Created a super PAC, going to rallies on his behalf. But it's interesting to note that Elon kind of only came to these right-leaning MAGA political tendencies once his own family members disowned him. And, I mean, he could just be kind of having a very significant mental break. The relationship between Trump and Musk has always been a little bit complex. Initially, Musk was critical of Trump's policies, especially on climate change. And now, post-election, it seems that Elon Musk has been the physical personification of Donald Trump's testicle. In a way that testicles have a wide amount of influence over men, Elon Musk also, while clinging to Donald Trump, seems to be exerting his influence as well. He has been appointed to lead the newly established Department of Governmental Efficiency, which we will definitely talk about at some point, which has the goal of streamlining federal operations. And while this role is unofficial, it positions Musk as a key advisor in the incoming administration. Not only was Musk a few weeks ago, right after the election, on a call with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, while Trump was, which is just absolutely insane to me. It's like, why the fuck is that dude on these calls? Especially when Musk himself has ties to Russia, and on top of that is not an elected official at all. Musk apparently met with Iran's UN ambassador, and the Iranian people, the Iranian government, did describe the meeting as positive, and it was apparently focused on reducing tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Just the fact that he's getting on these calls and meeting with these diplomats in person shows that a private citizen is now going to be stepping into diplomatic arenas that have been traditionally reserved for government officials. And this is for good reason. Diplomatic negotiations are the purview of elected officials and seasoned diplomats and representatives, because these people are accountable to the public and they're bound by established protocols. When people like Musk start making deals and engaging in these kinds of activities, it completely undermines official channels that have been established for years. It can create conflicting messages between Musk saying one thing that may or may not benefit the United States, but also serve to benefit his own businesses, because it's not like he signed a conflict of interest waiver or anything like that. And who's to say that Musk is always going to put the interests of the United States over that of his own? The lack of transparency and accountability in having Musk deal with foreign leaders privately, it just poses a substantial risk to coherent foreign policy and the appearances that we send to other nations abroad. And then lastly, just another quick point on Trump amid his cabinet appointments. He's also putting his own personal lawyers into the Department of Justice as well. Among some of these nominations is Todd Blanche. He had been selected for the position of Deputy Attorney General, who would serve second to Matt Gaetz if Gaetz is confirmed. Gaetz, who has minimal legal experience. So it's only a question that if Gaetz is going to be deferring to anyone on certain important decisions, it would likely be Blanche. Blanche served as Trump's lead attorney in the hush money case involving Stormy Daniels, and throughout his legal trials and tribulations. I do want to note that the hush money case involving Stormy Daniels is a case that Trump had lost as well. Emil Bove is another member of Trump's legal team. He's been appointed as Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General. Again, a very high up position in the Department of Justice that will likely belong to people that Trump feels are completely loyal to him, not necessarily loyal to the United States as a whole. And kind of like the Federal Reserve, the DOJ has long been regarded as an independent entity tasked with upholding the rule of law without political interference. Integrating Trump's personal attorneys into its leadership will raise my concerns that there are conflicts of interest and a lack of impartiality with the decisions that the DOJ makes, especially when Trump has voiced a wantonness for retribution of his political enemies and has been crying that the Democrats have been essentially engaging in lawfare against him. And beyond the practicality of these decisions, It just serves to undermine public trust in yet another institution of our government. Trust for public institutions like the Supreme Court, Congress, are consistently getting lower. And it doesn't really serve the public interest to make even more decisions that will serve to lower public trust in a very, very critically important institution. Beyond all of this, in the midst of all of these administration picks, Trump is foregoing FBI background checks on certain individuals who he has nominated for office. Historically, nominees for cabinet positions undergo comprehensive background investigations conducted by the FBI. They are designed to assess a candidate's suitability for public office, and they examine, obviously, a wide variety of factors that may not be available to a private entity. And they do this with the goal of ensuring that individuals entrusted with national responsibilities are vetted as thoroughly as possible to maintain the integrity of public service. But Trump prefers to utilize private companies to conduct background checks for certain people. And the Trump transition team cites concerns over the speed and efficiency of the FBI's vetting process because the transition team looks to expedite appointments, but this introduces a few risks. Private firms are more expedient for a reason, primarily because it lacks the resources of the largest law enforcement entity in the country. The FBI has comprehensive resources and a wide authority to conduct these background checks that private entities may lack. And this can, for whether it's intentional or not, result in the appointment of individuals with undisclosed issues that could compromise their ability to serve effectively. It just all ties into what I've been talking about, where we're decreasing the amount of transparency and accountability there is and heightening the level of public distrust towards these agencies. And it's not just me who thinks that this is concerning. Legal experts, ethics experts, current and former members of Congress have expressed alarm over this deviation from standard procedure. Former George Bush White House ethics lawyer Richard Painter warned skipping FBI background checks on nominees can be very dangerous. And similarly, legal experts have noted that eliminating traditional FBI background checks for those who would flunk them undermines the integrity of the vetting process. And given the people that Trump is putting in these positions, Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, someone who has been accused of being a Russian spy or ward of Vladimir Putin, Congressman Matt Gaetz, who is accused of soliciting sex with minors. These are people that you would probably want to be as thoroughly vetted as possible to ensure that everything is peachy keen. But doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. So that's all I have for you this time. I talked for way longer than I thought I was, but that seems to be how this goes. So God bless you if you're listening to this whole thing. And if you didn't and you couldn't get all the way through it, I deeply apologize. But I will be doing another episode of the Told You So podcast, episode 3, Nightmare Blunt Rotation. Who will be next in the rotation? We will see. But it'll likely be Tom Holman, the Borders are. Because that motherfucker is creepy and will likely do some terrible, dangerous shit to families and communities across our country. So definitely keep an eye out for that. If, as always, if you have any comments, feedback, or just nice things that you want to say to me about how the podcast has been so far, feel free to shoot me a message, leave a comment, and liking this video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and sharing however you can. Rating it 5 stars on Spotify will only serve to help me out in the long run, and I would greatly appreciate it. Have a beautiful, beautiful rest of your day or night, and I will see you soon.